Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon, and I am the creator and the moderator of TheChocolateLife.com. We're here today to talk to you. I am here today to talk to you about where chocolate comes from. And that may sound like a pretty crazy question because I think a lot of people have a good idea about where chocolate comes from. But what I wanted to explore today is maybe it's not exactly what you think it is. And so I want to remind everybody who's watching who's watching live that they can participate in the comments. So go into the comments, let me know where you're connecting from, and I can do a shout out on the screen. And of course, please ask any question you'd like in the comments, and I will get it up on the screen. We'll get the question asked and answered. Before I jump into the heart of today's presentation, what I want to do is I want to go and remind everyone that for every single one of these live streams, I create a post on The Chocolate Life. So this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life right now, and you can see what stories have been posted in the last recent while. You can scroll down, get a list of all the posts. If you want to know what might be further in the past, you can just click on the Load More button and go and look at the posts that have been done. While you're there, click on the Join button. I appreciate the support for what you're doing. Again, so where does chocolate come from? I suppose the easy answer is that chocolate comes from cocoa beans. And cocoa beans are grown around the world, plus or minus 20 degrees around the equator. And the cocoa beans then go from the countries where they are grown, and they're transported to factories all over the world. Some of the factories are in producing countries, but most of the factories exist in what it is that I call consuming countries. And that's, sort of top level. We don't need to know much more about where chocolate comes from than that. But obviously, if you know anything about chocolate, you know that the story is a little bit more complicated than that. The idea for today's live stream came when I started working with a couple of AI engines, right? One of which is incorporated into, a search engine that I use. So if we click over to this story here, where does chocolate come from, right? You can scroll down, right? And what we'll do is we'll find that I use a search engine called Neva, right? And recently the Neva search engine incorporated an AI tool. And so if you did a search, what they'd come back is they'd actually go and they'd use an AI to generate a summary of websites that were in its index to come up with an answer, and then provide me with the resources. And so I asked Neva, where does chocolate come from? And I'm going to grow this a little bit. I'm going to scale this up a little bit. And you can see that it says chocolate comes from the cacao tree, which it does. It's scientifically known as Theobroma cacao, which it is. Cacao, right? Not chocolate, originated in Central and South America and is believed to have started growing 100 million years ago in the lower slope of the Andes Mountains. Right, so that's a fairly straightforward, if not very detailed, explanation of where chocolate comes from. It comes from cacao trees, which originated in South America, not Central America, importantly, and it is known to have originated on the slopes of the Andes Mountains, and we know now that it's the eastern slopes, not the western slope. It could have been a little more precise. But I want to let you know that, it also pulled up, Neva does this all the time, it pulls up any relevant page on Wikipedia. And so the Wikipedia page about chocolate says that chocolate is a food product made from roasted and ground cacao pods. And that is actually not true, right? The chocolate is not made from ground up cacao pods. Chocolate is made from the seeds of the fruit of the cacao tree. And so the challenge I have, and this is the overall point that I want to make today, is to ask the question, is the internet a good source for information? I mean, Wikipedia is sort of up and down. I mean, there are some things it gets very right. There are some things that it gets quite wrong. And if people are using the information that they find in Wikipedia and other places. So they'll take this information, they'll copy it into their article, or they'll use it as a reference in an article that they're writing. They'll put a footnote to it, and then people will go to it. And it all of a sudden, this information about what chocolate is and what chocolate isn't, where it comes from, all of a sudden it takes on a life of its own. That this bad information somehow seems to replace good information. And so it's interesting in that Wikipedia has a whole bunch of editors, and the information that is presented changes over time. So I went, right, after I found this summary, and I clicked on the Wikipedia entry. Here it is. And what we'll do is we'll find that, since Neva grabbed the summary and put it on, displayed it on my search results, you'll see that it has changed somewhat. And so chocolate is now a food, which it is. It's made from the roasted and ground cacao seed kernels. Okay, that's correct. It's no longer made from roasted and ground cacao pods. It is available as liquid or solid paste, either on its own or as a flavoring agent. Cacao has been consumed in some form since at least the Olmec civilization. And it's much older than that, and we'll get to that. And it says, okay, so here's where we come down and things start to go off the rails a little bit. The seeds of the cacao tree have an intense bitter taste. That's true. They must be fermented. That's not entirely true. To develop the flavor, I'm assuming, of chocolate. That's, again, it's not entirely true. There's an entire culture of using what is called cacao lavado, or washed cocoa, and you just get a solid, chocolatey flavor that is nutty, but there's none of the nuances of fruit and flowers or anything. So you need fermentation to get to these nuanced flavors. So after fermentation, the seeds are dried, cleaned, and roasted. There are some steps between dried and cleaned and roasted that are overlooked. The shell is removed to produce cocoa nibs, absolutely, which are then ground to produce cocoa mass, which is unadulterated chocolate. That's absolutely true. Once the cocoa mass is liquefied by heating, it is called chocolate liquor. Well, this is a challenge. Cocoa mass and chocolate liquor are pretty much the same thing. Are we going to say cocoa mass is the solid form and cocoa liquor is the fluid form? It's not a distinction that I have ever heard, although liquor is actually an archaic term that does mean fluid. So it's right in that respect. But I don't necessarily know that there is a distinction between cocoa mass and chocolate liquor, right? The liquor may also be cooled and processed into two components, cocoa solids and cocoa butter. That's not actually true at all. In order to efficiently extract the cocoa butter from the cocoa mass or the paste, it must actually get quite hot. So we're not going to cool it down in order to be able to pull out the cocoa solids and cocoa butter. A baking chocolate, which is also called bitter chocolate, that's technically true, contains cocoa solids and cocoa butter in varying proportions without added sugar. That's also true. But powdered baking cocoa, which contains more fiber than cocoa butter, right? So I have never heard of cocoa powder referred to as powdered baking cocoa. And if you're not, up on the language of chocolate making, this is where I think, some people are going to get really, really, really confused, right? So much of the chocolate consumed today is in the form of sweet chocolate. That's the technical definition for what we call dark chocolate. Milk chocolate is sweet chocolate that contains milk powder. Absolutely. White chocolate contains no cocoa solids, no non-fat cocoa solids. So for the most part, this is a fairly good description of how chocolate is made, right? But it is fairly light on where chocolate comes from, and as a matter of fact, in some cases, is demonstrably wrong, right, in what it is that it's saying. Now, I've tried to get on the editorial team for this particular page, and it's a real challenge to be accepted into the community and to have your edits be accepted by the community. And at this point, I think that there's so much sort of wrong with this article that it would be better to start over than to try to edit this particular article. I think there are a lot of people who have an enormous amount of their own personal prestige tied into this. And so trying to make the changes, again, in my experience, the editorial changes get made very, 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 very quickly. Right. So this is a challenge. We have a lot of information on the internet. People go to the internet using search engines, Wikipedia, lots of other places to find information about where chocolate comes from. And what they find is incomplete, right? And in many cases, just plain wrong. And as anybody who knows, who spent any time working with me here, that watching these episodes of The Chocolate Life, or being a part of the Clubhouse episodes, or reading what it is that I have to write on thechocolatelife.com, you'll know that I'm pretty much a stickler for getting things right. I want to get things right. And so when I see information like this, which is published on the internet, and I know that people are using this as reference for their articles, it just bothers the heck out of me. And this is the purpose. This is the reason why I'm putting together this live stream today about where does chocolate come from. Right? And I think that before I jump into my own interpretation of this, do a little bit more. So number 2, Wikipedia. So chocolate is a food product, right? So that's the original one. It's since been edited. And I'll update this to let people know that it's since been edited since I did this. This facepalm emoji gives you an idea about what I think about that. But then I think what's really, really interesting is that I went to an AI. There's an organization called OpenAI, and they have an interface which is called ChatGPT. And I used ChatGPT to generate 2 different explanations. I asked the question, where does chocolate come from and how is chocolate made, right? And they say chocolate is a food made from cocoa beans. Let me make this a little larger for you. Again, one of the things I want to let you know that if you do go to The Chocolate Life right now, you'll see this post here, where does chocolate come from? And all this information is there for you. You don't need to follow along and get the URLs and all that kind of stuff. You'll be able to go, and if you want to go watch it right now, or read with me right now, you can, or you can go and look at this after the fact. The information is there, and I will update it to show you differences or things that might have been brought up, additional links that people find interesting that came up that I can include in the presentation just to fill it out for you. So chocolate is food made from cocoa beans, which are dried and fermented seeds of the cacao tree. I like this very, very similarly. I like the differentiation between cocoa beans as dried and the cacao tree as wet. It's a tropical evergreen tree, that it is. The tree produces pods, which contain beans. The beans are harvested from the pods and processed to produce cocoa butter and cocoa solids. That is true, although there are a lot of steps in that processed stage. So it's just sort of elided or conflated together everything that happens in post-harvest and what happens in the factory. So not entirely happy with the shortcut there, and the cocoa products are used. Yay. I mean, it's a really, really straightforward and technically good explanation. And this is from an AI. And it's better than I would have expected the AI to do. To make chocolate, the solids and butter are ground into a fine paste. This is, I suppose, called chocolate liquor. And the answer is absolutely wrong, because it's the cocoa beans, which are broken up into nibs, which are ground into chocolate liquor. We don't separate the cocoa solids and cocoa paste. So this is a fundamental misunderstanding that happens a lot. I've noticed in these AI generated, they don't understand the steps in the process well enough, and they get the process wrong when they think about the order that things get done in the chocolate making process. So it says we don't take cocoa solids and cocoa butter and grind them into a fine paste called chocolate liquor. We actually take chocolate liquor and extract the butter and get the cocoa solids, what they're calling cocoa solids. The non-fat cocoa solids are cocoa powder. So sugar, milk, other ingredients are often added to the liquor to make different types of chocolate. Yay. I mean, this is very, very straightforward. Chocolate has a long history with evidence use dating back to ancient civilizations in Mesoamerica. Right. So yeah, so that's absolutely true. Mayans and Aztecs believed that chocolate had medicinal and spiritual properties. They used it in some form of currency. Chocolate is so there's nothing, technically horribly wrong with all of that, with the exception of getting the process backwards and then misunderstanding what the history of cacao growing is. And that's one of the things I want to talk most about when I get to that. So I asked this, the same engine right afterwards. You have the ability to what they call regenerate or resubmit the question. And sometimes it's a lot of fun to say, back to back within a few seconds of each other, how does the engine answer the same question, right? And endlessly fascinating to me. I do this regularly. So chocolate is a sweet, typically brown food preparation of cacao seeds, roasted and ground, often flavored vanilla. It is made in the form of a liquid, paste, or a block, and used as a flavoring ingredient in other foods. I'm technically correct. I mean, I don't like it as much as the description in the version 1. Chocolate is made by roasting and grinding the seeds of the cacao tree, which are found in pods on the tree. I suppose that's technically correct. The seeds are cocoa beans. Interesting. I like that disambiguation. The seeds are in the tree, and the technical definition, as far as I'm concerned, between seeds and beans is that seeds, when you plant them, can grow into a tree. Beans in cocoa, when you plant them, will not germinate and therefore will not grow. And so I find that a very, very useful definition between distinction between seeds and beans. So are then processed to create cocoa butter and cocoa solids. To make chocolate, the cocoa butters and cocoa solids are combined with sugar. And that's, again, not actually the case, right? The beans are ground into paste, right, which can then be separated. It's not the other way around, right? Chocolate is native to Central and South America. It's native to South America, and we'll get to that. It's a long history, dating back to ancient civilizations in the regions. The cacao tree is thought to have originated in the Amazon rainforest. That's true. It was prized by ancient Maya and Aztec civilizations. We've just gone from South America to Central America, and technically Mexico is in North America, right? Today, the majority of the world's cocoa beans are in West Africa, although they're also grown in other tropical regions around the world. So, there are good parts about each of these definitions or each of these descriptions, and there are bad parts about each of these descriptions. And so what I do, the way I would use these is that, as a writer, sometimes I get writer's block. Sometimes I get stuck for a way to start thinking about something. And so what I might do is I might ask a question of an artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, a question, and ask it and it will generate an answer. And then I might ask it to answer the question multiple times. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull apart these answers and put them back together and actually generate what I think is a response. Because what I've got now is I might have some language that, looking at these things make me go, that description doesn't actually work. It's technically wrong. It has things out of order. It glosses over some really important concepts. And so, again, for me, I would never use either of these descriptions of how chocolate is made directly from the AI. What I would do is I would use it as an entry point for talking about these things, as a way of saying, oh, here are some ideas I may never have thought of. Here's some way of talking about this that gives me new words to think about these things. And for me, it's sort of like Beijing and tarot cards. I mean, I don't believe they actually divine the future, and they're not going to tell me the future or anything really about my personality, my personal belief. But what they are is they provide ways of thinking about the situation that you're in from a different perspective. And that different perspective enables you to look at things and come up with different answers. And for me, that's the intriguing thing about AI generators, is that they're going to look at some topic, they're going to look at it in ways differently from the way I look at them. They're going to spit back answers, and I'm going to be able to pull them apart and come up with some different responses. But the challenge is, again, right, is if you don't have much subject matter expertise in the area, so you're a college student and you've been asked to write an essay, right, and you come across this description, you just might cut and paste this essay into the answer, and you haven't learned anything. You don't know if the AI is right, and you don't know if they're wrong, and you don't know if they're right, how and why they're right, and if they're wrong, you don't know how and why they are wrong. And this is where I find the whole issue of artificial intelligence generating text to be problematic, to use the text that is generated, right, without actually doing a fact checking to find out if in fact it's correct. And again, the challenge here is if I tried to go to the Wikipedia article to go and fact check what it is that ChatGPT was generating, it would be a really, really interesting challenge to figure out and to come up with 1,000 words to answer the question where chocolate came from and how it is made. So I want to take a quick break, do a quick reset. You're watching The Chocolate Life Live. I'm Clay Gordon, I'm your host, and today we're talking about the topic, where does chocolate come from? If you've just joined us, go to the comments. Let us know, let me know where you're connecting from, what part of the world, and I can get that up on the screen. I want to do a shout out to Juliana, who's connecting from Brazil, I believe. Juliana, it's good to have your regular visitor here. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you have some questions, let me know. I'm interested in knowing what you have to say about the whole thesis that I'm going through today. So what I want to do is I want to point out in this live stream today some places where I think there is some really, really good description. And there's a friend of the channel named Max Gandy, and Max has a business called Dame Cacao, not Dame Cacao, Dame Cacao. We're pronouncing it using the Spanish pronunciation. And she has an article on her blog called "Where Does Chocolate Come From?" And I think that, I think this is actually a very well written, very, very considered, well researched article on the topic of where does chocolate come from. And she starts off, and I think, which is a great place, in saying, listen, many people think that chocolate comes from Belgium, and chocolate doesn't originate in Belgium. Now, cocoa beans may be transformed into chocolate in Belgium, but the cocoa beans are not grown in Belgium. So we start off with that sort of understanding. And it goes through, right, and it gives a good background in terms of the history and where things come from. And so if you're looking for a good description that you can use and you can internalize, right, and you can add to your understanding of where chocolate comes from, I believe that this is a good place to start. And you could look at the ChatGPT or AI generated descriptions or the Wikipedia descriptions, and balance them and sort of understand, okay, what it is that Max has written is well researched and well put together, and you can see the differences between what it is that she says and what it is that's written on Wikipedia. I think the important thing here, right, for me, and what it is that I want to get across, is that these things that you communicate in your voice, right, that you take this information from all these different sources and you put it together, and then you have the way you describe it, right, that is in your voice, that makes sense as if it's coming from you, not that what you're doing is you're reading from some website or you're just parroting some information that you might have heard from some people, that you're going through and making that you absorb all this information, and then you do a synthesis of it, a harmonization of it, perhaps taking bits of data here and bits of data there and putting together and creating the story that makes sense for you. I think that's really, really important to do. And as I said, I think this article from Max is a good article to use in that respect. But there are some not so good articles, and they are listed. I mean, just having fun, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's this article by the History Cooperative, Where Does Chocolate Come From? And what we find here is that the person who wrote this doesn't have what I think of as a strong technical understanding about how chocolate is made. So what we find is that what they have done is they have read a bunch of sources on the internet. They may have read some books or something like that, and they've come to a synthesis of it, and that synthesis lacks important nuance. And so again, the challenge here is that somebody is going to come to this article. the search engine, the Neva search engine. So when we come back up here, the Neva search engine, right, recommended this website as one of the sources that it drew from for its AI little summary that's up here. And so I went to each one of these websites and I said, oh, how can I find out what they are talking about? And so it's important to look through and find out, okay, where did the AI grab the information, and what information did they pull, and how did they incorporate it into what it is that's going on? So it's this question, again, I'm not going to go in and read this. Not again. I'm not going to go through and read this in great detail here. I encourage you to go through and read this. And when you do that, please go to this page on The Chocolate Life. So this is the post for today. And if you're a member, you can go down to the bottom and you can enter some comments. Tell me if I'm right. Tell me if I'm wrong. Do you believe me? Do you don't believe me? Where did I get it wrong? Where did I get it right? Let me know, right? I'm really, really intrigued to know what you think about this impression that I gathered from doing this work for you. And so there's another one, this Where Does Chocolate Come From? Instructables. This is another one that the Neva AI picked out. And this has got some wonderful pictures. I don't know who the author is, Tom Woods. So who likes chocolate? Where does it come from? In case your answer is from the candy store, this Instructable will clue you into some amazing fact about. So great, trying to engage you in what it is that's going on. So chocolate comes from the cacao tree. They grow in South and Central America. Farming is labor intensive. These appear to be plots. So, and it really is in the context of how to make chocolate, which is, I think, a really interesting way of thinking about this. It's like there's a little bit of time that's spent, where does chocolate come from, right? And then we're going to go from where does chocolate come from to how is chocolate made. And I think this is a really, really interesting way to go through and address the issue of where does chocolate come from. Now, I think Tom spends a whole lot more time on the how chocolate is made than where chocolate comes from, which is the issue that I wanted to discuss. But I think nonetheless, it's very, very worthwhile in terms of understanding. So again, what I would do is I would recommend going and taking a look at the sources that are here. I've got, what it is that the Neva engine says about where chocolate comes from. We have what it is that Wikipedia says where chocolate comes from. We've got what the AI told me was where chocolate came from. And this is fun, what happens when we give AI a chance. I was thinking, all we are saying is give AI a chance. A musical connection there for those people who get it. And then to point to some places where I think you can go and get some good information. Some of these good information, bad information, right? And some of these were used by the Neva AI to generate its summary. This is what I do on a regular basis. What I have to do is I have to work from my experience, and then I have to go through and look at multiple sources of information. The sources of information may complement each other. They may contradict each other. They may talk about things that I hadn't considered and expand my understanding in ways that I might not have thought about in the first point. But when it comes to the fact that, I'm looking at things like the Wikipedia article, the fact that I know that so much of this is not quite right, what it says to me is that I have to take everything that I read in Wikipedia with a large grain of salt, because I know what I know about chocolate. I don't know what I don't know about all these other topics. So I'm very, very careful about how I use Wikipedia, and you should be too, right? But one thing I would like to know is, again, and you can put these on the comments here when you're watching live. You can do this, whether YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook. Put your comments in the chat. Do you have some sources of information on these topics that you like, that you find to be authoritative, that you think are good, that you think are bad? I'm always interested in finding new ways to be able to talk about these subjects. to be able to find new words. Not everybody thinks about things in the same way. And so what I want to do is I want to be able to have as many different ways to talk about this as I can, so that when I talk to someone or I'm engaging with someone, what I can do is I can find out what they're not understanding, right? Because I can explain something to someone, I can't understand these things for them. And so I want to have different ways of explaining so that they can come to the understanding that I have. So if you have some great resources that you're using, please let me know about it. I would really, really be interested. And as I say, you can do it in the chat here on either YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, or go to TheChocolateLife.com. Scroll down to the bottom of the page. You do have to be a member of The Chocolate Life. There is a free member level. There's always been a free member level. If you do have the ability to support what it is that I'm doing financially, obviously, thank you very much. I appreciate that. But it's not a requirement, and there's no pressure one way or the other to do so. But now, about halfway through today's episode of The Chocolate Life Live, talking about where chocolate comes from, what I want to do is I want to step back and sort of give you a much wider picture about where chocolate comes from. And I'm going to start off by taking a look at this bit of research. So this is a bit of research that was forwarded to me by one of the authors, the author Francisco Valdez. And so I met Dr. Valdez when I was in Ecuador in October. He was giving a presentation, and then he was also given an award by the local government of the province of Guayas for his contributions to understanding the origins of cocoa. And so when we talk about where chocolate comes from, we know it comes from cacao trees. But where do cacao trees come from? Where do they originate? And so we don't know exactly where cacao trees originated. We do know that they first, popped into existence or evolved, probably not popped, over a long period of time. They evolved in what we now think of as the upper Amazon River Basin, right? And so that would be on the eastern slope of the Andes Mountains. Now, we think that the center of genetic diversity is in what we would now think of as southeastern Ecuador, in a province which is called Zamora Chinchipe. And that the first use and domestication of cacao would have been done by the Mayo Chinchipe people, right, in an area called Santa Ana La Florida. Right? So that we can get from archaeological evidence, right? And this article that I've posted here actually goes through the archaeological and DNA work that was done, analysis that was done to say, okay, here we think we have a hypothesis that says, oh, no, we don't think we have a hypothesis. We don't think we have a hypothesis, but we have a hypothesis that says this is where cacao, if it did not originate, at least this is the oldest evidence that we have for the use of cacao and its domestication. And this domestication part is important because prior to the domestication, the cacao would have been wild harvested. The trees would have existed in the area. People would have gone on and pulled the fruits off the trees. Now, how did they know how to? How do they know to think of the pods as perhaps food? And that's a really, really interesting question. When you're working, when you're living in the rainforest, and this is something that I learned from reading a book called 1491, which is the history of the Americas before the arrival of Columbus. So it's a fabulous book. I recommend it to everyone. And the author goes through and says, we think of South America as being a place where there are vast areas where humans have never visited, and it turns out not to be the case. But in a rainforest, it turns out that most of the nutrition in the rainforest is either in the trees, right, up in the leaves, or in the ground, right, or it's in the streams, right, and that that when you're looking around for food, it becomes a real challenge. And so what people would have noticed is that birds, animals, monkeys, rodents would have would have broken open the pods and started consuming the seeds. But they only would have been consuming the pulp, right? They would not have been consuming the seeds, which are bitter. And in that respect, the cacao tree is just like evolutionarily, it's an amazing tree. It's got this really, really colorful fruit. Bright colors are attracting birds and other animals. The pulp, after the pulp will ferment spontaneously into alcohol. These are things that the animals are going to be interested in. And because they don't consume the seeds, they're going to spread the seeds. And that's how cacao spreads, because the pods are what are called indehiscent. They don't fall off the trees. And so if you're going to survive in this kind of environment, you have to be a really good observer of nature. And so you notice what animals around you are consuming, and you consume those things. And that's probably how humans started working with not started working, but started noticing that cacao was interesting. They would have pulled the pods off the trees, broken them open, and the fact that the pulp is extremely sweet. We know it has chemicals in it, theobromine, for example, which is a central nervous, or it's a stimulant. I don't think it's a central nervous system stimulant, but it is a stimulant. They would have been really, it would have said, ooh, this is something that we can incorporate into our diet. And in fact, the first uses of cacao appear to be, we find remnants of starch grains, which are found inside of drinking vessels and storage vessels in the Santa Ana la Florida area. And that evidence, right, supported by DNA analysis, goes back to about 5,500 years BP, before the present, right, or about 3,500 BCE. And that is the oldest archaeological evidence we have for where cacao was first used and domesticated. Although in my personal conversations that I had with Dr. Valdez, he told me that they can hypothesize that they can push this back another 2.5 millennia. So as far as 8,000 years BP, that the people in this area would have at least harvested the wild trees, and then what they would have done after harvesting those wild trees would have said, okay, can we breed the trees in order to be able to do something with them and make them more amenable for our use? And we need to be really, really aware of the fact that these peoples were incredible observers of nature and were in fact superior breeders. I mean, they took plants and did amazing things with them. What we think of as hearts of palm, for example, did not exist naturally. They were in fact bred, and then once bred, spread throughout the Amazon river basin. And so it's not surprising that thousands of years ago, what they would have done is they said, these trees, they grow far away. We want to bring them closer to us. We're going to look at trees which appear to be more productive, and we're going to try to plant those trees. I mean, the pulp in these from the pods on these trees appear to be tastier, and so we're going to do, or there's more pulp. I mean, this is the sort of thing that you have to do if you want to survive in an environment which is not very calorie dense. And so this is where over the course of thousands of years, we would have seen cacao go from a wild harvested product or white harvested plant into something that would have been domesticated. And from this part of the world, the cacao would have been seen as an object of trade. And so we do know that there was trade between the coast of Ecuador and the area around Santa Ana la Florida. It turns out there's a natural dip in the Andes Mountains. I believe it's called the Huancamba. I have to remember, it's called the Huancamba, which would have made it easy for people to go over the Andes and do trade. And we know that this trade was done because we find examples of shells, marine shells, in Santa Ana la Florida, and not, not in, not embedded in rock layers like fossils. They would have been, used as part of for decorations and other things like that. So we know that there was trade, and so from Santa Ana la Florida to the coast, and then from the coast, the cacao would have been traded north into what we think of today as Mesoamerica. And we have evidence of dating back to about, I believe it's 1900 years ago. I forget if it's 1900 before present or 1900 BCE. I believe it's 1900 years before present. That dried cacao made it all the way up into what is now the United States. So we have a product that's being traded all over the Americas, well before the arrival of Europeans. And so, yeah, I want to take a quick jump from here and give a quick shout out to Samir Giha. Sam, if you don't know, Sam is one of the founders of Cacao Suyo down in Lima, Peru. They're a fabulous chocolate maker, one of the most awarded chocolate makers in South America, perhaps the most awarded chocolate maker in all of Peru. And Sam says, "Hi, Clay." Hey, Sam. Good to hear from you today. It may be interesting to make mention of the Juan Carlos Montemayor findings. And so, yeah, I think that's an excellent place to go. I'm going to go someplace else first, but I'm going to get back to that because I think it's important, right? So we have this history recorded of cacao pulp being used, perhaps fermented, perhaps eaten fresh. But we have to ask the question, when did people start using the seeds? Right? When did they start taking the seeds? When you think about it, there's, if you want to store the seeds, right? People knew that you had to dry things, because if you just leave the seeds sitting around, they're going to get moldy and mildewy and they're going to get yucky. And so, by this time, people have figured out about preservation, and they would have said, okay, how do we preserve the seeds? And they would have done that. Not sure when fermentation became a thing. It requires a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of labor for this fermentation. But they probably would have figured out drying first, so they could have a store of them for when there weren't as many pods on the tree as they. Because it was between the two major productive times of the year. But it's unclear where that happened, right? So we don't actually have good, solid archaeological evidence of the use of cacao seeds as opposed to cacao pulp until after cacao arrives in what we think of now as Central America. We find the Olmecs and the Toltecs. The cacao has come into this part of the world, right? So, right, we don't have evidence of the use of the seeds until then, right? And what's also fun to understand is that we think of these two varieties of cacao. We think of Forastero, we think of Criollo. They're not genetic names. They have nothing to do with the genetics. We've just applied them, sort of glommed them onto, become larger genetic markers, genetic labels for things. It turns out that there are, in fact, two what researchers call structure groups. There's a structure group which we call Forastero. There's a structure group which we call Criollo. And the Criollo name just means native or from here. And so when the Spanish arrived in Mexico, the cocoa beans that they found near them became criollos. Comida típica y criollo, typical native food, criollos. They're here. And the Forasteros became the cacao that was found in other parts of the New World. So the cacao from Ecuador and Peru, Venezuela, places like that were the Forasteros, right? It's an example of the language of the victors. That's how the names came to be. But it turns out that it looks like the Forastero varieties, the Forastero structure group, is the original structure group. That is what originated in South America. It is not until the Forasteros, some Forastero varieties, were transported into Mesoamerica that we start seeing the domestication of these varieties into what we now call Criollo. Now, one way we can differentiate is that we know that there are different base pairs, different numbers of base pairs in the DNA of the two different structure groups. But Criollos appear to have originated in Mesoamerica as a result of deliberate breeding. And so one thing, excuse me, Sam, this is something you can probably corroborate, is that white beans are recessive mutations in most populations of cacao. And what an observant farmer or an observant culture would have noticed is that these white beans are less bitter than the darker beans. And so they would have started, okay, I'm going to take a white bean cacao, and that's what I'm going to plant, right? So I'm going to, over time, I'm going to create varieties which have higher and higher percentage of white beans, right? And why would we have done this is because the cacao bean became recognized as a food in and of itself, independently of the pulp. Again, we're not exactly certain when that happened. We're not exactly certain where that happened, but the notion, right, that the domestication happened, that the breeding happened, right, to convert forasteros into criollos, to breed, right, a varieties of cacao that were not as bitter, right, that perhaps would have required less labor in terms of fermentation to make them more edible. That seems to be posited as a strong driver for where that transformation would have happened, right? So Sam mentioned Juan Carlos Montemayor. So Juan Carlos Montemayor was part of a research team. He led a research team that in 2008 published the first real broad DNA analysis of cocoa throughout the Americas. And this is where we find that there aren't three varieties of cacao, which is what most of people thought. There are three varieties of cacao. We have forasteros, criollos, what we call trinitarios, which are just hybrids of forasteros and criollos that happened on the island of Trinidad, and hence Trinitario, because it's from Trinidad. But now we have these three distinct varieties. But what Montemayor's group found was that there were at least 10 different, distinct genetic varieties, and they fell into these two structure groups. We have this group which is called forasteros. We have this group called criollos. We're going to use these names because they're convenient. That's what people know about them. We're going to continue to use Trinitario. And what we find is that the center of genetic diversity, right, is in South America. It is in the upper Amazon River Basin. It is to the east of the Andes. And one of the things that we've learned over the course of relatively recent history, is that when you get closer and closer and closer to the center of genetic diversity of origin, what you do is you find that genetic diversity increases, right? And because what happens is that when the species are propagated, so you take them from one part of the world to another part of the world, what you do is you take one or two examples, right? You don't take all 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, however many different varieties they are, you take one. And so when cacao was transported to West Africa by the Portuguese, the dominant variety that would have been taken to West Africa was the Amelinado forastero, which originated, we believe, in Brazil, perhaps, maybe in the modern state of Pará, somewhere in that region is a good possibility for where the Amelinado originated, and where the first material that would have been transported from the New World to the Old World and planted in West Africa. That's where it would have come from, right? But the first recorded archaeological evidence for cacao beans being consumed, right, come from Mesoamerica. We find it in the Olmec and Toltec civilization. It would have then been followed by the Maya and the Aztecs. And here we find the cacao seeds being roasted on a comal. They would have been winnowed, so we take the shell off, and then on a metate, using a mano, we would have ground the cacao beans up into a paste. And that paste was not usually sweetened. I mean, sugar comes from India originally. Sugarcane comes from India, and it was a driver of colonial expansion of the New World, but it did not originate in the Americas. There are Melipona bees, so there is some small amount of honey. They're not nearly as productive as the European honeybee. Again, an introduction, right? But Meliponas do produce honey, but relatively small amounts. So there's no indication really that cacao would have been sweetened in a widespread way. Instead, they would have used things like vanilla. Vanilla originated in Mayan Mesoamerica. They would have used chili peppers. They would have used, there's something called ear flour. They might have used something called rosita de cacao, which is this really interesting Oaxacan flour that is a cross between curry and maple, which is phenomenal if you get a chance to try it. So they would have used local herbs and spices to be able to flavor their cacao, but not sweeten it. And we know that this product was drunk. It wasn't eaten, right? They would have taken the cacao, which they'd ground. They would have dissolved it into water, not always hot water, right? They often added a foaming agent, and it was this beverage that was consumed. The Europeans came, they saw what was being done, and the Europeans are the ones, Spanish in particular, who were first started adding sugar to the cacao paste that they found that the Aztecs and Mayans using when they brought it back. So for the most part, the Europeans were not really very, they didn't like chocolate very much, or they didn't like what they didn't like how cacao was consumed. They knew it was important, they knew it was valuable, but they didn't know how. They didn't like it. And so it was through the addition of sugar that it became something that the Europeans liked. They didn't start using hot milk to make a beverage until the mid 1600s in the UK. So we don't have this history of eating what we think of as a chocolate bar until very, very recently. I'm going to jump into that really, really quickly and get another point from Sam. Sam says, I don't like to get into a discussion of the exact origin because we may discover more information in the future, but it can be noted that Montemayor studies found that 6 of the 10 genetic clusters are from Peru. That's certainly very true, Sam, and everything that I've said so far should be taken with this is what we know so far, right? So this is the current state of understanding based on the research that has been done, right? And when we talk about what the origin is, what we need to remember is that the political borders of Peru and Ecuador, these are relatively new and they're fluid, right? So the current borders of Peru are different from the borders of Peru from 100 years ago. And so all of this we have this overlay on top of it that's a modern understanding. And we may find out that next week is going to be different. I mean, I was in Ecuador in October, and I ran into I was on a farm, and I ran into a tag on some of the trees from the Montemayor sampling, right? Which was a phenomenal experience for me. All of a sudden I'm on a farm and boom, I'm connected to this, the 2008 research in a way that I had never expected to before. But Sam, we also need to understand that sampling bias is in there. They may not have performed as many samples in other parts of South America. I mean, they got to the places that they got to, and so absolutely, right. While we don't know the exact origins, and I think I said we don't know the exact origins, and what we have is archaeologic evidence for the first use in domestication, right, by the Mayo Chinchipe peoples in Zamora Chinchipe in what is now southeastern Ecuador, right? And we'll take it from there. From there, it travels all over the place, right? It travels all the way up into what is currently Utah as dried beans by 1,000 years or more before the arrival of Europeans. And we are still struggling to understand, how we go from using the pulp to understanding when we started using the beans. It's not clear at all. We haven't found much archaeological evidence that supports this is where it happened first and this is when it happened first. Right? I want to jump from there and say, that chocolate was consumed by Europeans and Americans. I mean, the first chocolate factory in the United States predates the American Revolution, or is around the time of the American Revolution, so 1760s. We find that people like the Marquis de Sade were huge chocolate fans. What they consumed was very different from what we're used to consuming today. The modern day chocolate bar didn't exist, or the modern day chocolate didn't come into existence until the mid 1800s. It required the invention of the cocoa butter press so that we could take cocoa butter and add it to the cocoa paste. This would have happened with the Fry family, right, in 1847 is the first recorded incidence of that. And then we have to jump into the 1870s when Rudolf Lindt accidentally discovered the conch. And so modern chocolate, what we think of as chocolate today, so we say, where does chocolate come from? We can say that chocolate, as we know it today, is a product of the Industrial Revolution. And it didn't exist until 1879 in Switzerland, right? But the history of chocolate, the history of where chocolate comes from, can be traced back. We have good evidence to trace it back to the upper Amazon River Basin, the eastern side of the Andes, at least 5,500, 5,900 years before present. We think that we can find the use in evidence for the use, and we think researchers in the field with experience in the area believe that they can find evidence for the use and domestication of cacao that goes back another 2,000, so about 8,000 years before the present. But we don't know, again, Sam, you're absolutely right. We don't know where the first cacao tree that we would recognize, right? So the way evolution works, it just, all of a sudden we have cacao all over the place. It's a series of very, very gradual changes over thousands or hundreds of thousands of years or more until we arrive at something. And it has an advantage in terms of propagation. So we don't know why these first trees were fitter than others to be able to survive in this particular environment, but that happened, right? And so we don't know where that first tree that we would recognize as a cacao tree, where in the Amazon it first originated. And chances are we will never know. All we can do is go and encourage the research that people like Juan Carlos Montemayor are doing, encourage the research that is being done by teams like this one, which is led in part by Dr. Francisco Valdez, and to figure out where the first use of cacao came in and where it might have first been domesticated. But this is where the story of where what we recognize today as chocolate comes from. What we recognize today as chocolate comes from the first use and domestication of cacao beans, right, in the Santa Ana La Florida region of southeastern Ecuador, what we now call Zamora Chinchipe, about 5,500 years ago. And with that, what I want to do is say thank you very much, everyone, for spending the hour with me to go to the Chocolate Life. Here we are. You can find the posts for every single one of the live streams I do. You can click on the calendar story. You'll find out which, so this is the scheduled live stream for today. I don't have any of next week's live stream scheduled, but if you scroll down a little bit, what you'll do is you'll find an archived every single live stream that I have done here on the Chocolate Life over the course of the last year. And if you want to, you can go directly to the YouTube playlist, and here you can go and you don't have to read the post on the Chocolate Life. You can come here and you just go play every single one of these episodes on YouTube. While you're there, if you are a YouTube member, you have an account, you can go and comment. If you don't have a YouTube account, come to the Chocolate Life. Well, if you're watching on YouTube, of course, you may have a YouTube account. If you are on LinkedIn, you can go to LinkedIn. Some of you, almost everybody who participated today, appears to be connecting from LinkedIn. You can go to the comment stream as you have and let me know what you think. And, unfortunately, I can't comment back on LinkedIn. So I think the comments that I enter go to YouTube. I think the comments that I enter go to Facebook, but they don't go to LinkedIn. So I have a tendency not to comment live during these things. However, I do get notified of all comments that are posted on the Chocolate Life, that are posted to YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And so I will be answering those questions when they do show up and responding to comments that people might be having. And with that, please let me know in the comments, right, wherever you might be watching today on TheChocolateLife.com, what you think, questions you might have about the topic, things you think I got wrong, other sources you think I might be interested in to help my understanding of this. And I appreciate all of the support all of you give to me. And with that, I want to end today's broadcast as I end every live stream with the reminder, hey, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong, right? Thanks everyone to watching to the end, and I look forward to seeing you at a future live stream.